Good afternoon. How was the food? Good. Well, thank y'all for joining us. Thank you for joining us worldwide. We are streaming live on LinkedIn and YouTube. And so we have a pretty large audience watching us. And I would like to thank everybody once again for attending this event. And right now, I'm going to introduce you to one of our board members who is going to introduce our keynote speaker, Rick Webb. Y'all give him a hand.
Good afternoon. Well, I first met Doug back in 1983. I was debating whether or not I was going to actually say that date. I sold a bunch of pumping units down in Farmington, New Mexico, and I got down there and didn't know what I was doing. And Doug ran a pump shop down there named Service Pump. He was also partners with the guy that owned the concrete base company. And they quickly started to educate me on how things ran down in the Four Corners. And so I got to meet Doug there. We were only 5 years apart, but he was already 16 years ahead of me in the oil and gas business. And I looked at him as a mentor. Now we appear to be the same age, but he still got a lot more time with it. But after that, I didn't see Doug again till Bakersfield, California, when we were working for a company that took over a big pump contract out there, and he was working for Weatherford, and we wouldn't have gotten that taken care of without working with Doug. I met him again at the start of the Eagleford Shale when he come to DNOW, where I both worked, and we worked side by side. And now through all that time, we're competitors, but still good friends, and I can still call on him for anything I need, as any of you guys can. Doug has done several papers for SPE and the Alrdc. He's got 4 patents on rod pumps. He says he doesn't work full-time anymore, but he's always working on something. I think you all enjoy listening to his speech and all the things that I didn't work with him on. There's another 50 years worth of memories and ideas and things that he's done. So with that, I'll introduce Doug Hebert.
First of all, I want to thank you for being here today, attending the conference today. And I also want to welcome everybody worldwide that's attending this thing, and I hope you learned something from it. And I've seen a lot of good exchanges of ideas so far. 1983, that's when I met Rick, and that was just 40 years ago. And it seems like 40 years is what it feels like. We're not going to talk technical today. Put your technical brain aside, but how do you talk about 56 years of advancement in the oil and gas business in 40 minutes? Well, we're going to give her a try today, okay? So I'm going to be cramming a lot of information in, but I'm only going to talk about 4 subjects. The 4 subjects are going to be divided. I'm going to divide this into decades, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s. And I'm going to talk about 4 subjects in each one of those decades. Number 1, pumps and how they evolved and why they evolved. And what drove the changes that we saw. Number 2 is going to be gas interference. The two biggest problems you have if you're going to try to produce a pumping well is gas and sand. So we'll be talking about pumps, gas, sand, and the last of the 4 is safety. So since I'm going to kind of condense this into as fast as I can, let's start with the 1960s. In the 1960s, we were producing wells that were in the neighborhood of 4,000 feet. 3,000 to 4,000 feet. That was the common well, the average well. And we looked at 5,000-foot wells as being deep wells. And when we started doing this, we noticed some shortages in in the pumps that we were designing, and we were using stainless steel balls and seats. And when I started doing some memory, by the way, everything you're going to hear today has been fact-checked. And everything that I'm telling you today has been fact-checked, and it's 100% correct, because what we're going to be talking about is my memory, okay? Things that I remember, all right? We were using stainless steel balls and seats, and when I started to research this, I noticed, it brought back something that I had just recently read, and it was a quote by Henry Ford in 1916. Henry Ford set out not to make a better car. He set out to make a better way to build a car. So he didn't offer everything that we have today. And one of his procurement guys, I think it was asking him about the colors that he was going to, the paint that he was going to need for these cars that he was going to be producing. And he said, how many different colors? And Ford's answer was, you can have a Model T Ford in any color you want as long as you want black. And that's kind of the way I looked at back on the 60s and saw that in the 1960s, if you wanted balls and seats, you could have any kind of metallurgy you wanted as long as it was stainless steel. And so that was kind of the way we looked at it. So that was always an issue in the 1960s. And we addressed that problem when we saw that wells in the 5,000-foot range, that we would have some damage to the balls and seats. And by the way, I brought a ball and seat so that we know what we're talking about here, because this is the pump today. Okay, this is the whole pump, ball and seat. And it's a one-way valve, that's all it is. It allows fluid to move in one direction but not the other. And but when we moved into a well that might be 5,000 feet deep, and I'm going to quote one more guy and then I'll quit quoting. I'm going to quote Justin Wilson, who was a great Cajun chef and a storyteller, and I've been accused of being both those things too. They asked him, well, there was a publicist who noticed that Justin Wilson always wore a belt and suspenders. And this publicist one day asked him, Mr. Wilson, why do you wear suspenders with your belt? And he turned to him and he said, well, that way my pants won't fall down, and it's one less thing to worry about. So we took that kind of attitude and said, if one's good, two's better. So we started running double valves, 2 traveling valves, 2 standing valves. Once again, this is not going to be a technical presentation. It's more about an evolutionary thing. So we had, in deeper wells, we would double valve. And that's just tandeming 2 of these instead of 1 in each one of our positions. So that's the introduction to pumps in the 1960s. Gas interference, well, because the object of pumping a well in the 60s was not to make gas, it was to make oil. So gas was thought of as an impediment to being able to pump your well. So, and it was legal to do it. We opened the casing and vented it to the atmosphere, and that was allowed. We got rid of that gas that was causing us problems with pumping these wells. There wasn't much gas to speak of because we were in shallow wells primarily. So that was the method for addressing gas interference in the 1960s. Sand's always been a problem. It was a problem in the 1960s. It was a guy by the name of J.O. Martin, John Martin, who came up with an idea. Sand in a rod pump is to the detriment of the rod pump. It will stick the pump, seize the pump. That's usually the worst case scenario. Best case scenario is that it's going to wear it out real quickly. But Martin came up with a plunger, and of course he named it the Martin Ring plunger. And he had anywhere from 60 to 120 rings on it, and these were fabric and rubber ring, and it was 5-ply rubber cotton duct rubber, cotton duck, rubber, for 5 plies of that. And the object was to, when it went into the well, when it reached the fluid level, or the fluid, it would start to expand. And as it expanded out to match the ID of the barrel. As it started pumping, it would produce and wear the rings, and as it wore the rings down, they'd continue to expand. So these rings had a lifespan that was X number of months or whatever it was, but you could move the sand that you needed to move in that lifespan of these rings. And it prevented you from having a quick pump failure due to either sand damage to the plunger or sticking to the pump. So that was basically what we did for rod pumps. Now, I started in the oil field in Natchez, Mississippi, and there was a lot of drilling going on over there, and my dad was with Exxon at the time, and he was at his 30-year level, and the way we addressed sand over there at that time was we came up with this plan where we said, the producers came to us and said, how can we get quicker return on our investment? Because when we drill this well and we have a frack and the formation makes sand, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to run a pump and try to pump it. And 2 weeks later, I've got a sanded off pump. And it may take 3 pumps before I can ever get this well cleaned up. And so we came up with some ideas, just bounced around some ideas. And it's the first time I ever thought about innovating in the oil field. And I was a young kid and was watching this happen around me. We came up with an idea. There's an apparatus called a pump anchor, similar to a tubing anchor. You run it in the hole, a tubing anchor, you run it in the hole, and you manipulate it, and it will hold the tubing in place in tension wherever you put the anchor. And so we put it on the bottom of a pump. When we would run the tubing in this new well, we would put our seating nipple, let's call it at 4,000 feet. We're going to run our pump at 4,000 feet. Well, we've got a first stage pump depth that is not exactly at 4,000 feet. What we would do is we would put this anchor on the pump, run the pump in, and land it at, say, 3,500 feet. And we would pump it from there. And, of course, we were going to pump it off. Well, we knew we were going to pump it off, but we were going to give this producer a couple of things. First of all, any liquid that he needs to get out of this well, including oil. So he's got some immediate return on his investment of the drilling. And Natchez, these were poor boy operators over there. And so we might pump it for 2 months, 3 months, maybe 2 months. But didn't solve the sand problem, but it solved the revenue problem. And so at some point when we pumped this well off, because we were 500 feet above where we wanted to pump it from, we'd go out there with a rig and add 200 feet of rods. And then we'd go ahead and put it back on pump. And we wouldn't come out of the hole with the pump, we'd just add rods. Drop that anchor down, reset it, and now we're producing closer to the ultimate area that we want to pump from. When that one pumped off, then we would make have to make a decision. Do we try to finish cleaning up this well and land it at our 4,000 feet? And that's what we would do. But it was a way that they could produce these wells without additional rig costs that were substantial, and without losing the first 2 pumps they ran in the hole, or 3 pumps that they ran in the hole. So that was something that we learned, and it's always stuck in my memory. Maybe there's something that we can. I just planted the seed in your head, and now maybe we can use that same thing that we learned back 50 years ago to produce your wells. Let's talk about safety. I'm going to give you the whole presentation that I got when I started in the oil field for safety. It didn't come from the company I went to work for. it came from my father. He started as a derrick hand, in 1930, and this was in the 60s. And he had become a production superintendent for Exxon. And when I could tell he was happy when I got the job in this pump shop. And when I got home, we kind of celebrated between us. And he said, now let's sit down and talk about this. And I said, yes, sir. And he said, what do you see? And I said, I see your hands. And he said, what do you see? And I said, well, I see your fingers. And he said, that's correct. How many do I have? And I said, just like you, just like me, you've got 10. And he said, and that's what I want to talk to you about. You're entering an industry where you can lose a finger very quickly. You need to make sure that before you put your hands on anything or before you do anything, that you look around and make sure that you're not sticking your hand in some place that'll take your fingers away from you. And then you need to look to your left, and then you need to look to your right at the two guys standing next to you working, and keep an eye on them because it can come from them too. And you can die there. End of the subject, end of my safety training for the 1960s. So that's where we were. Let's move on to the 1970s. The 1970s, we started drilling down deeper and producing wells from the 5,000-foot level. And what we considered to be a deep well back then was 6,500 feet to 7,000 feet. That was a deep well. By this time, I believe I was in Farmington, New Mexico at the time, I think. That depth change from 4,000 average to 5,000 average or 6,000 average really showed up in the balls and seats. And we started having a lot of ball and seat damage at that depth. And we had moved away from stainless steel seats and gone to things like stellite. And if I'm not mistaken, I think we ran our first tungsten carbide seats about that time. Most of the damage we saw in the balls and seats were in the balls. And so we moved to stellite and then almost went to double valve everything. So once again, we didn't want our pants to fall down, so we were running 2 valves in each spot, 2 standing valves, two traveling valves. The stellite was probably the go-to ball at that time. On gas, we were still venting gas in the 1970s out of the casing. And in the 60s and in the 70s too, we never got a chance to look at that well. We never got a chance to look at where they were putting the pump. We were told what pump to build, and we built it. And the input about what the conditions were in the well were minimal, even in the 1970s. And so when we were told, hey, I've got gas, we didn't look at that well bore. We looked at the pump itself, and we said, how do we minimize gas interference in a pump? So we invented some add-ons to the pump, like ring valves and challenger valves and lock-no plungers. And all of those were, we know what the problem with gas caused, gas locking or gas interference. And so what we did was we tried to remove that hydrostatic, because we thought the problem was hydrostatic. The hydrostatic was too high, too much pressure. And we couldn't open our balls and seats. So we put in ring valves and things like that would buoy up kind of that part of that hydrostatic, which let us open that ball and seat a lot quicker. So we took a well problem and tried to fix it with the pump. Not a very successful way of doing it, but we did it that way. And of course, the lock-no plunger was a purely mechanical traveling valve. But all of those items that I mentioned had their own problems. And so they were successful, but marginally so. On the sand, the improvements that we made in the 70s on the sand were Martin started to see some competition in the type of ring that we were using. And everybody knows how a swab cup operates. It collapses going down the hole, and then when you pull up on the swab cup, it expands out and it lifts the liquid. And so we saw some rings evolve that use that same pattern, like the Jetty Fag, Johnson Fag. There were several different ones, and you know they were a lot more hardy than the Martin ring was, but they counted on being able to expand out. And if you got sand in the groove sometimes, it would hold them in the out position, and that was fine when you went up, but when you tried to go down, you were stripping the rings off. Once again, we were trying to fix a problem in the wellbore with the pump, and that was our job at that time. So that's what we did in the 70s, was we changed the type of rings that we were using when we had problems with sand. Safety. I think the first time I ever bought a pair of steel-toe shoes was in the 70s. I never had one before. I never owned a hard hat until the 70s. And I had to use a hard hat that was a loaner from the shop that I was working in most of the time, and put it back in there. And if I got on location, which happened quite frequently, if I got on location and I drove up and the rig crew didn't have hard hats on, I wasn't going to put mine on. You know, you stand out for one thing, and that's the way you felt that back then. You stand out, and you're the target of you know, what are you afraid of? You know, I'm afraid of you dropping something on my head, for one thing. But so there was no such thing as mandatory safety gear. In the 1970s, you would think that that's kind of strange. Well, it was everyday affair. In the 70s, we started to see real professionals move into the safety professionals moving into our industry. We got tired of losing guys and losing fingers. And it was very difficult to make that transition because there was no training prior to the 1970s that I remember at all. And so we had started things like monthly safety meetings. You know, that's not near enough, but it was an attempt to start introducing the way you think about what you're doing out there. And so that's when we started to at least see some safety. Let's move on to the 80s, because the 80s are a lot of things happening in the 80s. The average well that we were producing was probably at 6,000 feet, and a deep well was 8,500 to 9,000 feet. And I remember thinking and having discussions with people a lot smarter than me, are we approaching the maximum depth that we can pump a well? How are we going to hold that rod string together? You know, these were questions that I was astounded that we would put a well on a pump at 9,500 feet. Well, once again, here we go again. Now we've got double valved balls and seats, and now we need something better. And so what do? Luckily, there were companies out there, I don't know how they found out, but were willing to think out of the box. And one of them was Coors Beer. The Coors Beer Company also owned a ceramic factory. And that was the advent of the ceramic ball and seat. And I'm going to tell you a little story. I'm kind of known for stories, okay? And this is a true story. Like I said, it's been fact-checked. We were having problems with balls and seats. They weren't holding up. One thing I want to impress upon you, well, we'll do that in a minute. So in walks the Coors ball and seat salesman one day at my shop. And he walked in with his chest poked out. He had a ball and seat that was impervious to any fluid that you might have in your well. Nothing would bother it. And you could hit it with a hammer and it wouldn't even mark it. And he said that, and so I gathered my people around for the demonstration. He was going to demonstrate this ball and seat for us. And he picked up the hammer off the pump bench and he whacked it like that and nothing. He said, now look at the ball, nothing wrong with it. Well, what he didn't know was I had a gorilla working for me back there, and he was standing watching this demonstration. And when he said you can hit it with a hammer, my gorilla walked up and said, well, we're going to find out. And so he took the ball, and all pump benches have holes in them where you can put a wrench head so that you can steady whatever you're working on. It's kind of like a backup. Well, you can change out that head. So what we did was he took the wrench head out of there and got one of the balls that the guy had and set it in there just so it fit like this, just like it was sitting on a seat. And our Coors guy was standing there with his arms crossed, of course. And my guy walked over and got a sledgehammer. And he said, everybody better back up. And he hauled off and hit this ball with that sledgehammer. And it was like a gunshot in that shop. And the ball took off and hit the wall on the right side, about the ceiling, and it made it to the back wall and hit the ceiling, almost at the ceiling there, and fell behind the pump rack over here on this side. So, and we were standing around like he had fired a gun in the shop. So one of the guys went over there and went underneath there and pulled it out of there and brought it back and handed it to the Coors guy. The Coors guy wiped it off and set it down, and that ball was pristine. And I could not believe it. I could not imagine a metal of any kind, a metal ball, being able to handle that kind of impact. And that's one thing that I was impressed about, was I always knew that a ball and seat comes off to allow fluid to go this way, and it goes back down. And it stops it from going that way, and then it comes off and it goes back down. If you're pumping 8 strokes a minute, it does that 8 times a minute. What we forgot was that the hydrostatic load closes this ball. And this ball is going to impact this seat at whatever that hydrostatic load is, minus any fluid cushion that you have here. Well, at a 7,000-foot well, 6,000-foot well, what is are we talking about 3,000 pounds, 4,000 pounds maybe, of hydrostatic load? So this thing impacts this thing, and at 3,000 or 4,000 pounds. And it didn't even after 30 years in the business, I didn't realize that's what I was trying to make work. Something that was under that kind of abuse. So taught me a lesson about balls and seats. And it's worse if you make any gas and you lose that fluid cushion around that ball. It's worse then. Or if you pump the well off, it's worse then. So that's why we were seeing this 3,000 foot. I was able to pump it with this ball and seat. But look what happened. Little by little, we started getting deeper and deeper and deeper. And we had to react. There was no place to go look for a manual on what metallurgies I needed on balls and seats, and to even know if they were available. And they weren't. All of these innovations were following the problem, and that's how they were getting solved. And we also, in the 80s, we saw what we now call a silicon nitride ball and a silicon nitride seat. And no doubt, some of the best in the world. But we were still double valving in the 1980s, and if you double valve with two silicon nitride balls, adding 2 silicon nitride balls, you double the price of the pump. Okay? That's a big negative when you're trying to discuss balls and seats with a producer. So silicon nitride was used, but it was very seldom used. They wanted you to find a cheaper alternative to it. Gas all of a sudden became valuable. It became a commodity, number one, because the deeper we went, the more gas we had. So we decided, hey, let's capture that gas. So there was no more venting going on. And of course, we were from a safety standpoint. Venting gas on location is a scary thing sometimes. And many times I saw guys smoking in the 60s, smoking, standing over the well, wrenching rods and all. It's pretty scary stuff. We started having to address gas, and we decided, we're not doing a very good job of it because the volumes had gone up, really interfering in the pump. So let's do this. Let's try to work with the producer and figure out, can we improve this by the placement of the pump? And so we started looking along those lines, and that didn't start till the 1980s. They didn't want to give us the information. We begged and pleaded, and we got some, and we started becoming involved in the well as a system. Not until the 80s. And so we came up with things like the pull buoy gas separator, which is nothing more than, somebody said it's a few joints of tubing. What it is bull plug, 1 or 2, maybe 3 joints of tubing from the well, and then the pump, a perforated sub, and a pump hanging down in there. So, and the thinking was that the gas would go up the casing and wouldn't want to go in the perforated sub and fall down to the intake inside that mud anchor. And seemed to, it took care of the free gas that was in the well, but it didn't take anything, didn't do any good for anything that was entrained. It was probably the most popular way in the 80s to prevent gas from getting into your pump. It had a big drawback. You could, if you made any sand, it followed the liquid. It deposited in the bottom of your gas anchor or in your mud anchor, and sooner or later it built up. And at some point, before it completely locked the pump up, you would start drawing sand into your pump. You'd get degradation of the pump. You'd go out there and pull the pump. You would run another pump back in, and 2 days later, you were getting degradation because you didn't clean out the mud anchor. So on the next one, you'd pull that pump, pull the tubing, clean it out, start all over. So you had to retrieve the pull buoy gas separator in order to clean it out, to reuse it. In the 80s, the tubing purge was invented, primarily driven by the coal bed methane that we're going to talk about here in a minute. But the tubing purge was replaced the bull plug. And so the, hurry up. so that we purged out the sand that was trying to accumulate. So that was, we call that it always reminded me of the jumbo shrimp, an improved pull buoy separator. Because we had to get involved with the wells in the 80s, we really had had to spend more time on location at times, and safety became more and more valuable, more and more important to us. And so we started seeing things like lockouts and things like stop works. Stop works were started in the late 80s. Let me move on, because there's one more. I had an ulterior motive for everything you've learned so far, and I wanted to get in before I had to go to the 90s and the 2000s. In the 80s, we started, for the first time in the history, producing coal bed methane wells. And Amoco was the driving force in that. And I was doing all of Amoco's business, so they said, hey, we want you to come in and let's sit down and talk about it. We want you to work with us and help us figure out how to pump these wells, because they very quickly found out that they had to pump them. And so I said, okay, great. We sat down and I said, how deep are these wells? Oh, they're 3,500 feet deep. Okay. How much gas do they make? Well, when you put the pump on, they don't make any gas at all, maybe 10 MCFD. Okay. Do you have a lot of oil? Oh, we have no oil. We have only water, and we have the Pacific Ocean down there to move. So here we are faced with a well that's 3,000 feet deep that makes no gas. We probably are going to have some coal coming back at us. Hey, that's a 1960s pump. So what did we do? We took the model of the 1960 pump, stainless steel balls, double valve them, run them in the well. Didn't work. So we had to learn how to pump these wells because we did not know how to pump them. But after a couple of years, this is the last story I'm going to tell you. A friend of mine who was also a customer of mine, his company just entered the coal bed methane wells and in the same area. So he came to me and he said, Doug, you're the only person having to face this problem of pumping these wells in the San Juan Basin there. And so I'm president of the SPE, he told me, and this year we're having our yearly convention in Denver. We want you to present a paper and give a talk. And because I was working on both coal and oil, I said, Steve, his name was Steve. Steve, I just don't have the time. I just can't find the time. And he said, well, I understand, but would you think about it? And I said, of course I'll think about it. Well, I didn't. And about 3 or 4 weeks later, Steve called me again. And he said, did you think about it? I said, yeah. And I still don't have time. And he said, well, Doug, we really need you to do this. And I said, I understand that, but I'm sorry, I can't do it. And he said, okay. Well, third phone call, he called me. And he said, Doug, I need you to start on the paper. I said, Steve, I've told you twice already, I can't do it. And he said, well, I'll be damned. And when he said that, I kind of looked at the phone, and then here comes the tirade. I thought my dad knew all the cuss words in the world, but this guy knew more of them than my dad. And he was cussing me, and I couldn't put the phone near my ear. He was yelling so loud. He was just yelling at me. And the next thing I could understand what he said was, you take, you never give back. And he said that about 4 or 5 times. He said, you've got 3 sons, and you're raising your sons and going to put them through college on the back of this industry. When he said that, I said, okay, stop. I didn't want to put it by my ear and tell him to stop. I said, stop. He stopped talking, and he said, what? And I put it up there, and I said, I'll do it. And so I wrote the paper. I found the time. I made the time. I presented it. And the format was 12-minute talk, 6 minutes of questions. And Steve, this guy, was also the MC. I did the 12 minutes, and I was the last one before before lunch. We did the 6-minute, and then another 6 minutes, then another 6 minutes. Then he said, I'll put you down at the bottom of the stage. Anyone who has questions, come down there and ask questions about it. And it was just all the way through lunch. And what it told me was several things, but one of them was, he was right. We have to give back to this industry. We can't go in a book and figure out how to solve these problems. It's got to be done at the field level. It's got to be with the cooperation of our producers. It's got to be a joint venture. It's got to be us mentoring the youth that's coming into our industry now. Us old guys are not going to be here forever. Some of us think we are, but we're not. And I've mentored 5 guys in this industry. 4 still are in the industry. But I'm telling you that it's your job. You are the leaders of this industry now. And you've got to take this by your hand and lead these young engineers to the right solutions. If I leave without giving back to the industry all of the things that I've learned in 56 years of being in this industry are gone. And those who don't study history are destined to repeat it. So that's the ulterior motive of why I wanted to talk to you. And I promised Mike Poitras that I would give you that story because Mike knew that story. And he said, that's your key point, Doug. And I wanted to give you that. Okay. Am I out of time? Huh? 2 minutes. Okay. Let's talk about the 90s and then we're done. Because most of us have been in here since, or been in the industry for a while. In the 90s, all of a sudden we were at 8,000 foot for the 8,000 feet for the average depth of a pump, and maximum of 10,000. That's the magic number that I never thought was possible. Balls and seats, we went to. All of a sudden, we had these other metallurgies that we could try, and we were running a lot of nickel carbide balls over tungsten carbide seats. We always have been, tungsten has been the go-to seat for years and years and years. Silicon nitride saw that they were too high, and they came down, and we saw more and more and more silicon nitride balls, and so we all of a sudden didn't have the problem with balls and seats when we chased these depths with premier balls and seats. And during the coal bed methane, I found out that if you have a dirty well that makes some sand, makes some coal fines or whatever, when you tandem two of these in a row, then you have a greater possibility of damage to these balls and seats because the stuff that has to, the oil that goes through there and the water that goes through there has sand going through there or particles of some kind. And they have a penchant for accumulating in there if you've got two balls and seats in tandem. That's one thing. So I, in the 90s, I started getting away from double valving. Hey, we double valved because we didn't have good balls and seats. Now, today, that was in the 90s. Today, we've got titanium balls, titanium carbide over stainless steel, and stainless steel, over extreme, which is a little hard, it's a blend of tungsten carbide. Why are we double valving? Guys that know me and know how I've been on that soapbox for most of my career, and we're still double valving, so I haven't been very successful. But why spend more money for a pump that gives you less performance at a higher price? And that's the way I feel about it. I'm going to have to close it off now. So I had more to say because I had about 20 more years to talk about, but this is what you get when you try to put 56 years in 40 minutes. Okay. Any questions? We want to open it for questions. Wasn't technical. Yes, sir. My first patent was a locking equalizer. Also, the tubing purge. I mentioned the tubing purge. Those patents have, by the way, have already run out. And then with Weatherford, I have a couple of patents. And my name's on the patents.
If you're producing solids, there's what, you got the double valve, you're saying if the solid will get stuck with the double valve?
You bet you. You've got a lot of, you plug it up and you're done. It's a catastrophic failure. If you're running particles through two tandem cages, have your pump shop put them together and then look at them. And what you'll see is there is not a very good, this hole, the traveling valve, which is a lot smaller than this, the traveling valve is small. It's the smallest orifice in your whole well. The whole well. And so You put two of those together, and what you've got is if you slow down the sand, it's going to pack off. If it doesn't pack off, that's the worst case scenario. Best case scenario, it's going to linger in the cage, and you're going to have damage to your ball and seat, because that grain is going to get on this edge right here, and this thing's going to hit it at 3,500 pounds or 1,200 pounds or whatever your hydrostatic load is. Where do you want it to pack off? You don't want it to pack off. That's exactly right. I'm an advocate of, I'm going to go the next step. I'm an advocate of not double valving. But if you just absolutely have to double valve the traveling valve. And here's why. Because not only am I getting sand caught in there, I'm cavitating through that seat. There's no way around it. Now, it didn't matter at 3,000 feet. It matters now. We have entrained gas, a lot of entrained gas at the deeper depths. And so I'm going to cavitate through my standing valve because I double valved it. And where is that gas going to go? Into my compression chamber. It can't go anywhere but into my compression chamber. And I learned that lesson because we were pumping coal bed methane wells that didn't make 10 MCFD unless you opened the 1-inch valve to try to put a gauge in it, and it sounded like a jet. And that was gas coming out of there. Well, there's no gas in the casing, but there's gas in the tubing. How did it get there? Cavitated out of the well, out of the fluid, going through the standing valve at least. And if it cavitates through the traveling valve, who cares? It's produced. But if you force me to double valve, I'm gonna double valve the traveling valve, and single valve the standing valve. I've never had anyone tell me a good reason to double valve when we went from stainless steel to the improved metallurgies. Because the only reason we ever double valved was to charge the producer more. That's one reason, or to have a backup so that our pants didn't fall down on that pump. And that's the only reason. And with the metallurgies that we have nowadays, I would never double valve. Good question. I'm glad you let me get back on my soapbox. Any other questions? Thank you.
Y'all give Doug one more round of applause, please.
Thank you.
So
Wow.
Doug was so gracious to give us such good information and history of the oil and gas industry. Come this way, Doug. And we just, on behalf of the Alrdc and the Rod Pump Workshop, we would like to present you this award for being our keynote speaker and all the great things that you've done for our industry. We really appreciate you, and thank you so much.
I tell you what, I don't have anything I'm more proud of right here.
So let's shake hands, Doug.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And now I'm going to introduce Dr. Victoria Pons.
Thank you, Joseph. So next, as I mentioned this morning, we have our first time ever Outstanding Volunteer Award, and this is going to Erin Ivy. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about her first. So Erin, we've had the privilege of working with her for many years, and she's been handling all of our LinkedIn and marketing. She's been absolutely fantastic. And to tell you a little bit about her, so she's an oil and gas professional with over 10 years, a decade experience in our industry and lately in artificial lift. She's a talented project manager, and her experience encompasses offshore and onshore work domestically and internationally. Currently, Erin is the sales and marketing coordinator for Floco Production Solutions, And I wanted to share also that she holds an active seat on the Pin Oak Charity Horse Show Board of Directors, because I think that's really awesome. And volunteerism and charitable contributions have been a passion for Erin her whole life. So, with this, I just want to ask Erin to come up and say congratulations and thank you so much for all your hard work for us. Okay, so apparently, so right now I'll give you a $100 gift card for the moment, and then we'll have an award. It's do you want to get it, Joseph? Or okay, so we'll give it to you momentarily.
Okay. I just want to thank the Alrdc and the oil and gas community as a whole. I think, like Doug said, you've got to give back in the communities that give to you, and this is just one of the ways to do that. So, thank you.
Okay, there we go. Here it is. Thank you, Erin. Yeah. So really, we do appreciate our volunteer. I mean, this is a volunteer organization only. So all the work, all the conferences that you see, it's all volunteer work. So we really do appreciate when you step up and volunteer with us. And next, I wanted to call Joseph Norman to the stage again and thank him for his extraordinary contribution on this event and his leadership, which has been absolutely outstanding. And for this as well, we have prepared an award. Maybe take a look. So Joseph, thank you very much for all your hard work. Much appreciated.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And now we'll proceed with the next session. Who are our session chairs for this afternoon? All right, Blake, well done. Thank you for volunteering. That's fantastic.
How's everybody doing? How was lunch? Everybody full? Well, I hope so. Anyway, so our next session is avoiding environmental and financial impacts of stuffing box leakage, which is something that's very important these days. So the presenters here are Victoria Pons and Robert Harrison and Elaine Lang. So if you guys would welcome them up, and they'll get started. Oh, just Rob.
Yeah. Sorry you're stuck with just me. I was always thinking that after lunch I'd get the sleepy crowd. But you never know for sure, you know. So I'm one of the northern kids up by Calgary. And I got to say, I thought we had wind up there, but last night, I don't know what was going on down here, but it got soot and dirt all over my new blue suede shoes. It's just terrible. What was that? It was like huge sandstorm. Oh! That's me. How do I work this thing?
It's just in here. You sent it in PDF, so it's going to be a little wonky. But
No, I sent down,
I think we'll make this one work.
oh, we can make it work.
This is it, right?
Yeah, because they asked me to, and
Yeah.
because at first they couldn't get it to go.
It says just flip it, and then he's going to pull the screen down.
Oh, okay.